Okay, it's time to talk Carlos Baleba. I think it's come to that point where we need to work out what Fabian Hurzeler is going to do with him and what you would do with him. Welcome back to Seagulls Central. My name is Adam MacDonald and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for coming along and finding this channel if this is your first time or if you're part of the biggest, best Brighton fan community out there on YouTube. Thank you for returning. As I always say, if you haven't done it already and you keep coming back to this channel, hit the subscribe button, turn your notifications on, and you'll be part of this growing community. And you'll be part of the 3,000 strong and growing group of Brighton fans that get involved in this channel. And I'm loving doing it. We are churning out some regular content, and we've got an interesting bit of content, interesting conversation to kind of get our teeth stuck into today and chew the fat over. Carlos Baleba, what would you do? What do you think Fabian Hurzeler should do? It's a sticky one, isn't it? Because, you think particularly with the Arsenal game coming up, you may be watching this even after the Arsenal game, it's still a relevant conversation. As we head into the weekend, after the Man United game, we approach the Leeds game. What do Brighton do? Even beyond that, what do Brighton do? We've got a player now who is a shadow of his former self, is a shadow of the player that we all saw last season. Looks completely at odds to the kind of £100 million player that we all believe he is. I still believe he is that. I've said it before. I think he's better than Basuma. I think he's better than Caicedo. I think he's a combination style-wise of actually both of those players and has attributes that kind of you'd pull across from attributes of both of those players that makes him at least an £100 million player. But, I think for Brighton, they've got a bit of a difficult situation now at the moment because we've got a player who really, if we're not careful, is going to see his value plummet. And, you hear Man United fans kind of joking around, it's brilliant, he's playing terribly, we want that. Another benefit of us winning at Old Trafford was that, Baleba played really badly. This now means we can get him on the cheap. We've done Brighton over. I think, to be honest, I would maybe make a bet, maybe not make a bet, but I wouldn't be that confident that Carlos Baleba will necessarily go to Manchester United next summer. I think in terms of the player we've seen and the quality that we've seen, he's a player who could play at a much higher level than Manchester United. However, at the moment, in terms of Brighton extracting the better value out of him, if we're going to come at it from that angle first, he's looking like a completely different asset to what he was 6 months ago, say, when the season ended. And it's quite concerning. I think, for Carlos Baleba, I think for him, things like concentration, things like dips in form have always been a bit of a challenge for him. I think that's a fair thing to say. He's a young player, signed him at 19 years old, probably now, 20, 21 years old. A very young player, still relatively new to England, only in his kind of second or third full season in England. But we're seeing real peaks and troughs in the way he's playing. I do think the difference between someone like Carlos Baleba and maybe what we saw in terms of Moises Caicedo is I think that Carlos Baleba is advised a lot better. I think Moises Caicedo was advised pretty badly in terms of the way he conducted himself towards the end of his time at Brighton as he was pushing a move. Whereas Carlos Baleba, I believe, despite there being a lot of probably lines fed to these kind of knockoff journalists through his agents, you don't really hear him per se through his agent kind of making any moves or wanting to seem too controversial or want to fight for some move away. You didn't really hear too much of that in the summer. So I would like to think that we haven't necessarily seen like an intentional drop-off. I saw some suggestion, it was just suggestion from fans kind of saying, do you think he's deliberately playing badly to try and kind of force a move or maybe get the price down to make it easier for Albion to sell him or move on from him? I'd like to think that's not the case. And I think that's probably something that fans just speculate about. You never really tend to see that in professional football. I think that's egregious behaviour from all parties if that is the case. But I think for the Albion, they've got a job in their hands because a big part of the Brighton model, a big part of what Brighton do is around getting the best out of these young players, bringing them in when they're kind of diamonds in the rough, and maybe young players that need to be shaped and moulded into the world class or the kind of, on their way to being elite talents that can then be sold to the big teams. Now, at the moment, if Brighton can't get the best out of him, that directly correlates to affecting their business model, doesn't it? If we can't get the best value out of him, it relies just as much on the recruitment side, getting him, Paul Barber, Tony Bloom, Jason Ato doing the negotiation around him, but also the coaching staff, the performance teams actually get the best out of him to then develop that value on him. I think for the short term, do Brighton look like a better side without Carlos Baleba in it at the moment? I think that's the question we need to ask. I would hope, recording this on Tuesday, that when we play Arsenal on Wednesday night, I would personally hope that we don't see him in that game. Not because I don't want to see Carlos Baleba in my team, but I want to see how Brighton can play without him. And I want to see a different way that Brighton can line up without relying on Carlos Baleba. Does it look like a situation where we could play Mats Wiefer in the midfield alongside an Ayari or a Gomez, or in the future a Jack Hinshelwood? I wouldn't hold your breath on that Wiefer one just at the moment. I don't think Hurts is going to make that move. But how do we look in terms of a midfield two with Ayari and Gomez in the long term? Do we have enough of that kind of the bodies, the legs, the engine that Carlos Baleba provides? I don't want to see him against Arsenal because I want to see the options that we've got and whether we can do it. My concern is that we can't. And actually, in terms of the profile of what we've got at the club, we do struggle in terms of replacing that profile. And I think, to be honest, we've kind of struggled, they're difficult players to replace, aren't they? Caicedo, we didn't really have a like-for-like style-wise replacement. Yes, we had maybe Billy Gilmore, Pascal Gross, we had other midfielders, even McAllister could sit deep, but they weren't the kind of combative tackler that Caicedo was. Same when we had Basuma. And now with Baleba, we don't really have that like-for-like option because he is a unique style of player. He's a physical player, he's an engine, he can drive us through the field, and that's one of his biggest strengths. So Brighton are going to have to find a different way to play with him. Brighton are, a high-pressing side, a very intense side in the way they attack and the way they press. Baleba is crucial to that. A player who can get in behind players, who can get right up the backside of players, create havoc in the midfield, intensity, engine. I get the sense that Wiefer, in terms of the way he plays the midfield, and I might be wrong, and correct me in the comments if I am, I always got the impression, at least from what we've even seen of him at right back when he drifts into midfield, is that he's one of those midfielders who is much less dynamic, is much less, running around, gonna kind of get all over the pitch. He's a bit more of a sitter, a player, a cruncher, a bit of a, the style of like a Busquets or even a kind of Carragher is the kind of mould of player I'd got in my mind just from watching him and seeing the way he moves. He doesn't move with such an energy and freedom that maybe Carlos Baleba does. But what do? Do you drop him? I think you certainly drop him against Arsenal just to see what options are there. Maybe bring him on in the second half if we need a bit more energy and legs in that midfield. I think it's going to be difficult. Declan Rice, I think, is fit for this game. He's sounding like he's going to play. They've got great options. Zubamendi, Norgard, Odegaard, brilliant options in that midfield that they can play, even if they're not going to play their first choice kind of starting 11 in the midfield. So we might need his energy in the second half. I think when it goes into Leeds on the weekend, we don't have James Milner. Maybe that creates a bit of an issue. It looks like James Milner, he's certainly not going to be fit for Arsenal. It looks like he might miss 1 or 2 Premier League games. In Brighton speak, when it comes to medical, 1 or 2 weeks probably now means 1 or 2 months. So let's see James Milner after Christmas with the rate that this is going. But it sounds like he's going to miss a couple of games. So does that maybe force the hand of Hurzeler? Does that make it a little bit more difficult for Hurzeler to kind of not play Carlos Baleba? If you are ever going to move Mats Wiefer into midfield, I suppose it does rely on the fact that Joel Veltman needs to be back fit, and it seems like while he might be creeping his way back into contention, it looks like he may be in contention against Leeds on Saturday. He probably won't be ready to start. So what do we do there? I don't know. Do you drop him? I don't know. I think you definitely drop him for Arsenal, and I think you assess things. I think you see whether he comes on in the Arsenal game. I think you maybe give him some minutes and you see how he gets on. I just think just because we don't have another option that's similar to him, that plays with such energy, even though he has been incredibly sloppy, even though he's been incredibly kind of lackadaisical and looking like he's kind of really not up to scratch, is having that kind of profile on the field better than just not having it at all? Ayari, to be fair to him, has that energy, but didn't have his best game against Man United. Diego Gomez, a goal-scoring midfielder, has a fair bit of energy himself, a nice passer of the ball, mover of the ball. He's not that kind of combative tackler that maybe Baleba has proven to be. So what would you do? What would you do? It's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one. And, I do trust him to turn it around, but I think, Carlos Baleba's proven for a while now, since his time at Brighton really begun, that actually, he is a player who has struggled with spells of not playing so well, showing inconsistencies. Concentration, I think, is a big thing for him as well. You remember De Zerbi speaking about him for a while. It took De Zerbi quite a while for him to really get Carlos Baleba integrated into that side. We spent most of De Zerbi's final season, which was Carlos Baleba's first season, playing Gross and Gilmour in midfield, both of whom we sold that summer. Carlos Baleba didn't have a proper breakthrough season being the man in our midfield until last season, for Hurzeler's first season after De Zerbi had left. So, and I remember De Zerbi talking about the inconsistencies, not his reluctance, but the way that we've heard Hurzeler talk about Tommy Watson, he's not ready, Costulas, Simas, they're not ready. You heard De Zerbi talking about how he's not ready to play my way, which clearly is a very, very bespoke way of playing football, which requires crispness, sharpness, a lot of clean actions, precise actions, concentration, and it seems like that is something that he struggles with. So what would I do? In the short term, I probably wouldn't play him against Arsenal, but I think I would stick with him just for now, just to see if he can turn around. Because we saw it at the AMEX last time out against Newcastle. He turned it around, got back to maybe 65, 75% of the player we know he can be with a pretty decent performance against Newcastle. But it's a different game, this one. And I think I would like to just see. Maybe when the stakes aren't as high, you might argue this game's a high-stakes game. A cup competition which we want to be winning, absolutely, I agree with that. But I think maybe there are other options in the midfield that I'd maybe start. If I was gonna, I'd probably play Ayari and Gomez in the midfield and just see how we get on. And then obviously you'll have to bring Baleba on later in the game because of the lack of options we have in midfield. But let me know, what would you do? Do you think it's too harsh to drop him? Do you think he deserves being dropped? Do you think Brighton will look a better side in midfield? And if so, who's at the replacement? What is the style of replacement? Do you bring Weaver in? Do you have to change the entire formation? What would your approach be? And do you think Fabian Hurzeler is brave enough to do that? I guess one of my biggest concerns would be that Fabian Hurzeler isn't necessarily a brave enough manager to do that. We've seen it. God, maybe that's a little bit harsh. Let me know if you think that's a little bit too harsh. But, we've seen it in the defence, I think, particularly around the centre-half. I think there's been decisions that should have been made so far around the centre-half positions. I think he's obviously got this style of play in the 3-4-3, which I don't think he's shown the kind... he feels like a manager who, once he's found his combinations, once he's found his favoured formation, he will stick with it. He's barely changed from a 4-2-3-1. He's barely changed in the league from the Jan Paul van Hecke and Lewis Dunk combination. He's barely changed from Minteh on the right, Rutter down the middle, Mitoma on the left. João Pedro, now it's kind of Simas, Danny Welbeck. There haven't been loads of changes in the team since he's come. We haven't seen him try out a variety of different things. I suppose that would be one of the concerns I have in terms of the Baleba thing. Would he have the wherewithal to drop him? Would he have the bravery to drop him? Because, he's issued a warning to Baleba. He has said, look, it's on you now to make the change. There's only so much I can do. You've tried to coach him. You've tried to give him the bum. But then you have to end up saying, look, it's on you, mate, and this is what you got to do. And yes, we saw a good performance from him against Newcastle. We saw a very different one, it has to be said, against Man United. What will we see over the next few games, and how will Brighton deal with it? Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think it's as bad as people are making out? Do you think he's had as bad a season as people are making out? Remember, form can change. We saw it with Danny Welbeck having a so-called bad start to the season, in quotation marks, and he's turned it around to score 4 or 5 goals so far this season and look like a very good player in the last 2 or 3 games, 4, 5 games even. So things can turn around, but with young players, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult, particularly when you've got all the speculation around them and you've got such a big money kind of price tag associated to someone like Baleba. Let me know, what would you do? Would you drop him? Would you change the formation? Who would you bring in? Do we have the right kind of player to bring in to replace him? Would you bring Matt Weaver into midfield? Would you go bold and do something different? Would you recall Malik Yalkule? What would you do to fix the Carlos Baleba problem? And do you think Brighton are heading in one direction, which is either selling him or losing a lot of money on him? It's a tough one. It's a very tough one, and I would love to know your thoughts. As always, as I say, if you've got this far in the video or you keep coming back to the channel and you've enjoyed this one particular, please hit the subscribe button, turn your notifications on, get in the likes, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I would love to know what you think. I will be back after the Arsenal game to review that game as quickly as I can after the game ends, and we'll dig into that conversation, whether we win, lose or draw, but ultimately we'll go to penalties, so we will see. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video, and as always, up the Albion.